Tens of thousands of people are expected to take to the streets of Glasgow today in a global day of action against climate change. The teenage activist Greta Thunberg will address climate campaigners as the first week of COP26 draws to an end. Millions more will protest in other towns and cities across the world. They want leaders to act now to prevent a climate catastrophe. Ashna Huranag reports from Glasgow.
They're up for a fight on an international scale. Their armoury, pieces of cloth and plenty of paint. The night before is spent at this warehouse where protesters are empowering one another before the big day. Georgina has travelled from London especially.
We're obviously at COP26, so if that in itself doesn't tell you that these past policies that have been created, even though they've been great in theory, have not been practically applied in the correct way.
And they don't want to wait any longer.
The last week of COP has been really, really disappointing, and that's coming from someone who didn't have high expectations to begin with. It has gone out of its own way to exclude climate activists, especially young people from countries around the world, especially people of colour as well, and those who are suffering the worst effects of the climate crisis already.
This disappointment partly echoed by the young activists who marched through the city yesterday.
In some respects, they're good pledges. Are they enough? And will we see the action? I'm not sure.
Young people are banging the drums. They're saying, you might not listen to us, but we're going to make our voices heard.
Thousands joined Greta Thunberg and other key climate figures as they took over the city. From saving the bees to planting more trees. Messages everywhere from those like 8-year-old Cameron.
Mine says, if not you, who? If not now, when? COP26, act now.
And why do you feel it's important that you guys are here today to join all the other people in protesting?
Because if we don't act now, then our planet could be in real danger.
From climate finance to deforestation to the indigenous communities to the impending catastrophe. Everybody here has their own reason for being here. There have been so many protests throughout this week. This one today, though, is going to be so much bigger. 100,000 people are pounding the pavements.
And that's just in Glasgow. Today is a global day of action. The voices outside could well overshadow the conversations inside as discussions of COP26 turn to protecting the natural world. If this rallying of the troops is anything to go by, their urgency reveals they believe their time is now. Ashna Huranag, Sky News in Glasgow.
Well, overnight, we've also seen protests from climate activists across other parts of the world, including Australia, where some think the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is holding back on committing to change. But as Siobhan Robbins explains, the prospect of wiping out fossil fuel is not something that everyone agrees with.
Hundreds of protesters have taken to the streets of Sydney today to demand immediate action on climate change. They want full renewable power by 2030. They want an end to coal power. They want pledges on methane. And there's also been protests going on in Melbourne as well. Lots of disappointment here from Australia's actions so far at COP26. Of course, Australia didn't join that pledge to cut methane. They also haven't been among the countries pledging to move away from coal power. But it's a very different message in communities like this one. I'm in the Upper Hunter Valley in New South Wales, in one of the coal mining communities. There are mines dotting the landscape around me. This is the main train line which carries the coal through the state. And when I've been speaking to people here involved in the industry, they say, well, it brings us really good jobs. We've got great wages. They invest in the community. We don't think we need to be moving away from coal for 20 to 30 to even 50 years in the future. They are very determined to carry on. The message coming out of these communities is if people around the world want coal, Australia will sell it.
Now, bosses at 5 of the UK's largest supermarkets have promised to halve the environmental impact of a weekly shop by the end of the decade. Tesco, Sainsbury, Waitrose, the Co-op and M&S have all agreed to work with the Worldwide Fund for Nature to reduce the impact they each have on the environment. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Enda Brady. And how are they planning to do this, Enda?
Well, Stephen, there are 4 key sectors that they will actively look at and work towards reducing their impact on. Now, the food sector itself is responsible for some 30% of global climate emissions. So this is a very significant agreement. The sectors they're going to look at: food waste and packaging, the impact on agriculture and seafood, forestry being cut down, and global warming itself. So we've got the chief executives of Tesco, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, Co-op and Marks and Spencer. Together, between the 5 of them, they have effectively half of the UK food market. So it's a very significant agreement. They're going to work with the Worldwide Fund for Nature. We've got a statement through from their chief executive, Tanya Steele. She's hailing this as a game changer. She says the promises these CEOs have made are game changing, and we hope other food retailers will follow in their footsteps so that every shopper can be confident the products they buy are not fueling the climate crisis and pushing precious wildlife closer to the brink. And as I say, the food sector is responsible for some 30% of total climate emissions. So a very significant deal reached between 5 major British retailers this morning.
OK, Enda, thank you. Well, after a torrid few days for the government dealing with the fallout from the Owen Paterson lobbying scandal, it's turning its attention back to climate change. The UK leading the call for an urgent global shift to a more sustainable way of farming to protect nature. Our political correspondent, Rob Powell, is in Westminster for us. I mean, is this the Prime Minister trying to get back on the front foot, Rob?
Yeah, I think so. And Labour, though, clearly trying to still inflict some damage on this sleaze row, calling for investigations now into Boris Johnson himself and over that refurbishment of the Downing Street flat, of his Downing Street flat, and also for an investigation as well into a holiday he took earlier this year to Spain that was paid for by one of his ministers, Lord Goldsmith, a billionaire minister. I think it will have been a disappointing few days for Boris Johnson after a sort of tentatively hopeful start to the COP26 summit in Glasgow. It has been pretty much completely overshadowed the last few days by this sleaze row. Today, what the government wants to talk about is Nature and Land Day in Glasgow. So we can expect pledges from governments around the world on shifts to a more sustainable way of farming and land use. Now, farming, of course, makes up a huge part of the climate problem in terms of emissions, both in terms of cows and methane, but also deforestation, land being cleared for farming around the world as well. I think the broader issues the government will face, and perhaps the criticism they will face today on this, is, to begin with, I think you will hear from a lot of environmentalists that say that this is merely tinkering around the edges, and for as long as there is demand for meat, for dairy, then there will be demand for farming, for food production that ultimately damages the climate. I think also as well you get back to this tension of between richer countries essentially asking poorer countries to do less of things that make them more money, and that raises the question of, OK, what sort of compensation, what sort of money is going to flow from richer countries to poorer countries to help them to do this? Now, today the UK government is announcing various allocations towards research, towards more sustainable farming, but also just aid money to go towards countries to help them farm in a greener way as well. But of course that is set against the context of richer countries missing that $100 billion a year target in climate finance, and also the UK as a country lowering the amount it gives in international aid in the last year or so.
OK, Rob, thank you. Well, for uninterrupted coverage of the summit, including special guests and analysis, you can watch Sky News Climate Live on Channel 525 and Sky Glass Channel 505. Now, people in England will be able to book COVID-19 booster jabs a month earlier under a change that takes effect on Monday. And as we head into the winter months, there has been a major breakthrough in the fight against coronavirus. Pfizer developing an antiviral which could cut hospitalisation and death by up to 89%. Let's talk to Professor of Virology at University College London and a member of Independent Sage, Dean Pillay. Good to see you this morning. I mean, actually, this isn't a new drug, is it? This is one that's being repurposed.
No, there's two drugs that have recently come on stream. One is molnupiravir, a bit of a mouthful, which is a specific antiviral, which itself has been developed previously against other viruses, but in fact has not been used clinically and widely. So that's one. And the other is one that so far we've just seen the press release from Pfizer for, and we await MHRA approval. But of course, this is good news to develop antivirals. I should just say in the context of this, that there are two phases of COVID infection. The early phase where, of course, you get infected with the virus and the virus replicates in your throat and nose and lungs. And many people, of course, recover from that. But the difficulty in the hospitalizations and severe symptoms and unfortunately death is due to the immune response against that virus. And therefore, many of the successful drugs so far have been developed to damp down that immune system, things like dexamethasone, a steroid, whereas these drugs are against the virus and therefore need to be used very early on in the disease process in order to have effect.
But in that sense, that's positive, is it? Because it means, presumably, that people are going to become less infectious as a result, so there'll be less transmission.
That's absolutely right. And so it's a great advance. But there is a big caveat here, is that in order for these drugs to be effective, they therefore need to be used very early on in the disease process, within 3 to 5 days of initial symptoms. And if we then think about what the logic of that, it means then that individuals, as soon as they get symptoms, to be tested, and if they're found to be COVID positive by PCR, something that may take some time, days, then they need to have access to the drugs immediately. These are tablets, so they're not injections. They need to have access to those drugs very soon in order for them to have effect. And for that reason, there's a lot of work now going on and other trials in the UK to work out precisely how best this can be used in practice. Because, of course, once people get into hospital, that is too late for these drugs to be used. So it becomes more of a health systems challenge about how best to use these effectively and to target them against for people who are particular high risk of getting severe outcomes from their infections.
See, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have this approach, and it's understandable, where we sort of think if there's a medication, we relax a little bit, but this is such an effective medication, but we need to be on higher guard as well. So it's a case of us testing, I guess, more frequently, or not ignoring the slightest symptom for this all to work.
Oh, absolutely, and it's of course no replacement for vaccination, which is if we look at individual interventions, is by far the most effective way to prevent being infected and transmit that infection. And of course, we're in the process at the moment of severe challenges to the NHS. There's been well publicised stresses on primary care, general practice. So the idea that you would test positive and then just ring up your GP to get a prescription to then go and pick it up at the pharmacist is clearly not going to be the model to maximise the use of this drug. But I completely agree, and it's important to stress that by far the most effective thing that we can be doing as individuals is to have our vaccination, make sure we've had double vaccination, where eligible, have the third dose as a booster. And of course, young people who are eligible to have vaccination now should have those. So that remains the important way to prevent spread of infection.
Just briefly, in terms of the booster, what difference do you think it'll make, the fact that people could now book in advance? We've got to wait 6 months after the second booster, but the fact you can now book it a month in advance, is that going to get more people on board?
I really hope so. I mean, we know that the initial vaccine rollout was hugely successful, and that was almost totally due to the primary care throwing their weight behind this, and having a lot of people working, volunteering to provide vaccines. Now, of course, the booster program has not been going so well. Young people being immunized is not going so well, which is also a reflection of the stress of primary care, but also a bit more of a mixed way of providing the booster. So I think any ways to make this easy should be encouraged, and I would urge the government to go further. I think they need to invest. Primary care is a good basis for doing this, because everyone has a primary care physician, everyone has a general practice, but of course more money needs to be going in to support that at this time when there's increasing stress on the health service.
Dean and Pillay, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, 2 hyenas at Denver Zoo in the US have tested positive for coronavirus, the first confirmed cases amongst the animals worldwide. Samples from a variety of animals at the zoo, including the spotted hyenas, were tested after several lions at the facility became ill. Zoo officials said the hyenas, 23-year-old Kibo that you see here, and 22-year-old Ngozi, are experiencing mild symptoms, including slight lethargy, some nasal discharge and an occasional cough. That's what I've got at the minute. In addition, the 2 hyenas, 11 lions and 2 tigers at the zoo also tested positive for the virus. All animals that are tested positive have either fully recovered or are expected to fully recover. 12 people have been arrested after hundreds of anti-establishment protesters gathered in Trafalgar Square. Demonstrators wearing Guy Fawkes masks then made their way to Parliament Square and burned an effigy of the Prime Minister. The protest is held every 5th of November on Bonfire Night. The US House of Representatives has voted to pass a $1 trillion bill that will see major improvements to the nation's infrastructure. This includes the rebuilding of roads and bridges, the modernisation of public works systems and a boost to broadband. The White House projects the investments will add, on average, about 2 million jobs a year over the coming decade. Now, Yorkshire County Cricket Club says it will do whatever it takes to tackle racism. That's the promise from the club's new chairman, hours after his predecessor resigned following days of criticism over the way the club handled allegations of racist behaviour. 2 other board members have also stepped down. More sponsors have withdrawn their support, and the BBC has announced it was dropping former England captain Michael Vaughan from one of its shows next week after he became drawn into the row. Sadia Chowdhury has been speaking to cricketers in Yorkshire about what the sport needs to do moving forward.
It's tough in these nets, where amateur cricket players practice even in the off-season. But if Asian youngsters thought things get better at the top, this week gave them a taste of what may come at them.
I'm from Yorkshire, so representing Yorkshire would be a big part of a cricketing career. But now, since that story's come out, I find it hard to really represent.
I feel like other people from other backgrounds will be considered before us, and I think that we'll have to be much better for them, much better than the other people to be selected.
When you hear things like this, maybe, it gives you a wider view of reality and say you might not have the same opportunities.
The future of the country's cricket talent lie in places like this. Youngsters who live and breathe the sport. But allegations of racism at one of England's most historic clubs have left many doubting their chances.
Sky News has spoken to British Asian cricketers in all levels of the game who say they're put off playing for Yorkshire. None of them wanted to come on camera because they say the industry as a whole isn't the kind of place where you can speak openly about your experiences.
It seems a long time ago that England's diverse World Cup winners helped boost the game's profile, with 10,000 more fixtures played in adult recreational cricket this year than when England lifted that trophy. Grassroots coaches say racism at Yorkshire looks set to unravel all that.
It unlocks all the good work that we've been doing for decades, and it takes us back to an era where racism was rife. But we've been making so much progress, so this sort of incident takes us back to that unfortunate era for Yorkshire cricket. Remember, it was not that long ago where Yorkshire had a policy where unless you were born in Yorkshire, you could play for Yorkshire.
Whenever Yorkshire play here at Headingley Stadium, they can count on a big contingent of fans from an Asian background. But today, they're expected to demonstrate against the club in solidarity with Azim Rafiq. In these nets, hours of practice are meant to pay off. But after this week's revelations, young players may need some convincing. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News in Yorkshire.
I just want to bring you some breaking news this morning about a situation in Texas where officials say at least 8 people have died and a number of other people have been injured after there was a crowd surge during a Travis Scott concert at the Astroworld Festival in Houston. It happened about 9 o'clock local time last night. Travis Scott is, if you don't know, is a rapper. The fire chief saying the crowd surged towards the stage while Travis Scott was performing. The show was called off, as you can imagine, but 8 people are confirmed to have died and several others have been injured at the Astroworld Festival. As we get more details through, we will, of course, let you know. OK, let's have a look at the weather.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, unsettled weather returns to the country this weekend. It replaces the cold northerly flow that we've had with some slightly milder conditions. So, wet start in the north and west, winds freshening, there'll be some gales over western Scotland. Elsewhere, largely dry but rather cloudy. Rain will spread across much of Scotland, northwest England and Wales by lunchtime. Central, southern and southeastern parts, breezy with some bright sunny spells. Let's just remind you of the breaking news this morning. And officials in Texas say at least 8 people are dead and several others have been injured in a crowd surge at the Astroworld Music Festival. Houston's fire chief told reporters it took place while Travis Scott, the rapper, was performing. The show was called off shortly afterwards. Now, Yorkshire County Cricket Club says it's going to do whatever it takes to tackle racism. That's a promise from the club's new chairman, hours after his predecessor resigned, following days of criticism over the way the club handled allegations of racist behaviour. Let's talk to community cricket campaigner Abdul Ravak. Good to see you this morning. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that Roger Hutton, who resigned yesterday, said in his statement, you know, he'd been pushing for change, he'd been trying to get something done, but unsuccessfully so, which is why he took the fall for this. I mean, do you think we are starting to see some change then?
I think so. I mean, the genie is out of the bottle. There is no hiding place for such behaviour and such conduct. And so, therefore, Lord Patel, I think, has got a very difficult task in front of him. But if there's anybody who can actually tackle this and repurpose and recover from this position, then Lord Patel has got the set of skills that are needed exactly at the moment, but not just for Yorkshire, but for also cricket as a whole.
Are you surprised at any of this? Because I mean, I think a lot of us. I mean, I'm no cricket fan particularly, but you know, I'm very much aware that there is a strong Asian presence in the game. I mean, I was really surprised to hear that there was still these levels of racism that are, I mean, not even just under the surface, that are breaking through.
Well, the reality of recreational cricket is a third of all the cricket played in this country is from the South Asian community. But then when you distill that down to facilities, investment, governance, officials, that number, unfortunately, is lacking. So that's where the disparity is between, the representation and participation and where the decision-making processes happen. So what we need to do now is make sure that there is that representation and there's that inclusivity in the decision-making, because ultimately, if we don't make the right decision, if there isn't that diversity of thoughts and thinking in regards to that, then nothing's going to change, is it?
I mean, it does seem extraordinary that you know, a panel found or upheld, you know, a number of these complaints. I think it was 6 or 7, but decided not to take any action. I mean, there has to be a shift in focus, doesn't there, from, you know, protecting the club to protecting the player?
Well, let's look at it from a governance point of view. How does it look when an independent investigation finds 7 of the 43 allegations upheld, and the previous chair apologises, but the institution of Yorkshire Cricket fails to act upon that? That's just not good narrative, is it, in any book? So unfortunately, the tipping point, I think, in terms of public perception and in terms of how this has escalated, is that issue. So then you've got to wonder the decision-making process behind that. You've got to think about the risk management process in relation to that, and why wasn't anybody asking, you know, what the implications would be? So when you do the post-mortem on this, you know, the risk analysis, the risk mitigation, the risk control, all of that, unfortunately, is lacking.
I mean, obviously, we're hearing that the Equality and Human Rights Commission are getting involved in this now and asking for further details from Yorkshire County Cricket Club. I mean, the fact that this is, you know, having this sort of impact, is this going to be a good thing for the whole game?
Well, I think the issue here is that, you know, we cannot isolate cricket from wider society. So there's a systematic issue here around racism and subtleties around Islamophobia as part of that. And I think the issue is, particularly on the back of the Black Lives Matters movement, people aren't going to tolerate this. And actually, for example, what we've seen from the sponsors, they're not going to tolerate it because it doesn't look good for them. So, you know, that's going to have a massive reputational impact for Yorkshire and cricket as a whole, because we need Yorkshire. Yorkshire is a global cricket brand. We have now cricket growing all across the world, and we can't tolerate this sort of behaviour. So the issue now is that it's going to hurt where it really hurts in terms of the bottom line. But if that then means that cultural change happens in the county, within the game, and wider society, then that's got to be a good thing. And you have to applaud Asim Rafiq's, you know, coming forward, and the personal stress and the mental stress that he will go under, as well as, you know, people in Yorkshire Cricket who I know and are doing some sterling work. But the thing is, enough is enough.
I mean, you deal with a lot of young people in the work that you do. I mean, what impact does that have on them? That these young people who you know, dream of playing in the big time.
Well, you know, people, when they see Moeen Ali, when they see Adil Rashid, they're icons, not just for the South Asian communities, but for the whole community as a whole. But when they see things like this, they'll think, well, is it a game for us? Are these institutions, organizations going to represent our values, going to sort of support our values? And what you've got is that whole talent potentially being lost because they will not feel comfortable. So the net loss of that is cricket in England and our competitiveness in the global game.
Abdul Ravak, really good to talk to you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's time to take through the papers once again with the journalists for The Guardian and Vice, Freddie McConnell, and the editor of Nottinghamshire Live, Natalie Fahy. Good to see you both once again. Natalie, let's start with the Telegraph, should we, in these changes to booking your booster.
Yeah, well, obviously this seems like quite good news, and there's been complaints that the booster rollout has been particularly sluggish. So good news that 10 million more people over the age of 50, excuse me, can book their booster vaccine from Monday. Now, the change to me seems actually quite small, and apparently it's that before you could book a week after your 6-month anniversary of the vaccine. Now you can pre-book your appointment after your 5-month anniversary. So they're hoping that 10 million more people will get this before Christmas. Now, obviously, there's been quite a lot of good news about COVID and the new pills that are coming out, which apparently have an 89% success rate in cutting COVID. So, you know, we'll see how things go over the next few months. But I think one thing we can say for certainty with COVID is that nothing is ever certain.
No, that's very true. Though I have to say, as someone who's been trying to book my booster, it's I think it will be easier now that I know from Monday I will be able to book it, because I don't know when the exact date of my, when I'm actually due, but I will be able to sort of get on the system, which is quite encouraging. To the Mail, Freddie, looking at the migrant crisis, which is ongoing.
Yeah, it's extremely concerning. So yesterday was it was a record number of arrivals of migrants from Calais in small boats, of 853 in total in one day. And then sort of beside that, you have just an angry war of words between government officials on both sides of the channel, accusing each other of not caring. Emmanuel Macron accused of focusing too much on the fishing boat dispute and not enough on, people literally dying, either trying to cross or, as one Eritrean migrant was killed after being hit by a train this week. So it's just, I read elsewhere actually that there haven't been any pushbacks from the UK side, which I think for anyone following this story from a kind of humanitarian perspective is a sort of small mercy. When I live just across down the coast from Dover, and we actually saw the border force practicing pushbacks a few weeks ago, which was a pretty shocking sight. So just knowing that that's not happening at the moment, when obviously it's very cold and very dangerous time of year to be crossing the channel, I mean, I suppose it's something. But yeah, Seeking Sanctuary, which is a non-profit, is quoted in the piece saying that the governments really just need to work together to keep people safer, which should be a no-brainer, one would think. But yeah.
Yeah, no, as you said, I mean, it is ongoing and ramping up, so it would seem. Natalie, to the Mail, and something which, I mean, I can't tell you how abhorrent I find it, particularly with my 18-year-old niece just starting at uni in the last month or so. This whole issue with spiking now is just seems to be getting out of control. Everyone is of that age and, is just so aware of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, and it's difficult to know where exactly the problem lies. I mean, the Daily Mail says this is a special investigation, but to be honest, I'm not surprised at all that you can buy these drugs on the internet. So the Mail is saying you can buy Rohypnol and GHB on the internet with express next day delivery, which obviously those drugs are well known for being used in nightclubs as spiking incidents. Now, whether it doesn't make it clear in this piece whether or not those drugs are going to be used to spike drinks, or whether they're going to be used, put in needles to spike women, because it is mostly women that are being attacked here. Because we are seeing a rise in incidents of women just sort of being jabbed with needles, which is just absolutely atrocious and so terrifying. Are nightclubs safe anymore for women? We just wonder, don't we?
I mean, it's just, I can't imagine how people are able to get hold of these drugs so easily, though. I mean, who's selling them online? I mean, it's absolutely illegal to sell that sort of stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it doesn't specify who's selling them online, obviously, but it worried me that you can get them so cheaply. The price of £20 was mentioned there. I mean, we're talking small amounts of cash here to do absolutely great damage to young women in nightclubs. What can women do? There's a case study there mentioned, and something we're feeling particularly keenly in Nottingham at the moment, because that was where the first reports of this sort of needle spiking emerged from. And we spoke to women in the city who said they just started wearing leather jackets on nights out and denim jackets because they felt they were less likely to get jabbed by a needle. Is it really right that women have to change their behaviour in this way just because of this sort of thing that you can buy, with next day delivery on the internet?
Well,
terrible.
No, I mean, the answer to that is no, but then I guess from a sort of uncle point of view, you just say do whatever you have to do to stay safe at the moment. But it's just the most disgusting situation. Freddie, to the Mirror, looking at obviously with the environmental stuff at the moment and melting glaciers, which are, I mean, it's a depressing sight with a depressing view to the future.
Yeah, so this is a sort of small piece focusing on one particular activist, a Peruvian activist who's 25 called Ines Yabar, who has come over for COP26 to talk about the fact that I suppose she spends a lot of her time on the front line as an activist in her home country, trying to prevent or slow the loss of glaciers. She says in the past 40 years that Peru has lost 22% of its glaciers, and she she mentions this, well, she says the phrase "pass the mic," which is interesting. I've heard that in other contexts. I know that when Sir David Attenborough was announced that he was going to retire his Instagram account, which has over 6 million followers, young activists like Ines called on him to, quote, pass the mic with a hashtag to give that audience to frontline young activists around the world. I don't think that's happened, but it's interesting to see that phrase mentioned here, and I just can't imagine how difficult it must be for someone like Ines to know what's happening back home. And maybe she was wondering, do all these activists, is it a good use of their time to be flying over to Glasgow, when they're spoken about in some quite patronizing and disparaging ways by sort of senior politicians? It must just be infuriating, to be honest.
Yeah, well, no, it's a good point, though. Natalie, let's have a look at the Guardian and children's diet, fitness and mood in the pandemic, and no surprise, it's not very good reading.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised at all to read this. It's really upsetting, actually. And, this is one of the effects of lockdown and the pandemic, that we're going to be seeing more of these, aren't we, over the coming weeks, months, years, decades. There's going to be report after report on the effects. But children, I think all of us can agree that they've been really badly affected by this. The closure of schools, not able to see their friends, and the sort of division between the people who have got laptops and access to food deliveries and all those kinds of things at home, and those who haven't, has really become stark. And the Guardian's saying here that 27% of children aged 10 to 11 said they suffered significant emotional difficulties. I mean, you've also got to think about, the conversations around the dinner table. It's unavoidable. How does that affect children? They're worried about their grandparents. They're worried about their parents. They're worried about friends, teachers at school who've got COVID, and, the ones who have long COVID.
It's a dreadful situation, there's no doubt. Look, thanks both.